Hello everyone, here we go with lecture 19 in a set of lectures entitled Thought as Word Dynamics. What are we dealing with? The philosophy behind the project I developed in the late 80s, an artificial intelligence project I developed for British Telecom entitled Anella, associative network with emergent logical and learning abilities, which turns out to be today, when we look back at what I was trying in those days, as a potent alternative to GPT's generative pre-trained transformers, which are at the center of large language models such as GPT-4, BARD, etc. In those days, I had developed a bottom-up approach to these issues, which are dealt with now very successfully in a top-down approach by these large language models. We're at lecture 19, so you understand that we've covered already some ground. I've described so far the statics of a network which is meant to be very plausible in terms of being a representation of the graph, the network we have in our brains, which could be described as a natural neural network, the one we hold. As you know, the way that deep learning systems are used, they use a representation of neural networks, an artificial one, but which is not plausible. It's not plausible that it works that particular way. If only because we know that our network works in the spiking manner and not in the feed-forward manner, which is implemented in these models. When I was working in these days, and when I kept thinking about how to represent what's going on, I wanted to stick in a very narrow manner, very tight manner, to what we know about the physiology and the dynamics of the network we have in our brain, that we may call our memory for short shrift. I've reached a point now where, after having described the statics of that network, what are the features of that network which is in our brain, and which I suppose operates and by gradient descent. That's the way I described it back in 1987. That was somewhat novel at the time, but I haven't changed anything in the way I view it. What is different between the large language models and my type of approach is that the core of the chaining of the words is probabilistic in the large language models. In my view, it was emotional. Why? Because the representation of the human being I hold in the background was that of psychoanalysis, and I'll say a lot more about that in the remaining lectures. We've reached a stage where I presented that what is held in one way or other within that network, which is our natural network within our brains, the one constituted of with neurons, is that it's constituted essentially by word pairs. And that's from a very old hypothesis held by Aristotle 25 centuries ago, that what is must be, according to him, the brick, the elementary unit of what is held in memory must be a word pairs. Now, after having said a lot more about the possible chaining chainings in the lecture, just let's say from 15 to 18, now I'm turning to a description of how holding in our brains within the network essentially what are pairs of words, how we manage to generate sentences out of it, things that we may call a thought or a speech process, and so on. And in what I'm going to say today, which was put on paper starting in the book called Principes des systèmes intelligents, that I published in 1989, and then in that text that I'm reading currently to you, which was written in the year 2000, what I'm going to tell about today is the way that starting from simple word pairs, we can generate sentences. And this is very central to understanding what is quite opaque currently, quite obscure, of how we can produce sentences. And sentences that have meaning as a whole, that the whole sentence has a meaning, and that a concatenation, a sequence of sentences, like let's say in a paragraph or in a whole text, can have meaning that holds, that's consistent, that keeps making sense when we generate it. Chapter 14 in my text, third as word dynamics, is called "A Speech Act is the outcome of several coatings on a path in the network." My view is that when we speak and when we think, we're within that space constituted of a large number of word pairs. What we're doing is creating a path within that universe. We connect some of the words there in a particular way. But it's not enough to just summon the word pairs. In order to produce a sentence, we need to do some additional work. What I'm going to do is today, in the lecture today, I'm going to describe the main principles of it, and then next time in lecture 20, I'll go into the details of these, what I call these coatings. A path in the network amounts only to a set of word pairs linked through the word that subsequent word pairs possess in common. And I give an example. Say milk white, white mist, mist moist, moist autumn. It may sound like a strange example, but that's because it's borrowed from Aristotle. It is in a text by Aristotle called On Memory and Reminiscence, and here's what it says precisely. The cause is that we pass swiftly in thought from one point to another, e.g. from milk to white, from white to mist, and thence to moist, from which one remembers autumn, the season of mists. If this is the season, if this to be the season he's trying, the person we identify with, is trying to recollect. Then these go through a number of quotings. I'm not quoting Aristotle anymore, this is me. Then these go through a number of quotings, ending up in sentences as we're familiar with. The image of coatings is fitting. Like a confectionery is dipped in chocolate, candy, frosting, etc., although the true mechanism is closer in our view to this. The skeleton of a speech act that the word pairs provide grows into a multidimensional space through various accretions. It is the sequential nature of speech that reduces ultimately the structure to a linear process, like the rolls in an old-fashioned washing machine that allow to express most of the water out. This view of sentence generation as a flattening of a multidimensional structure was initially developed by the French linguist Louis Tenière in his structural linguistics, essentially in the 1950s. This idea that when we think in a multidimensional space, and it's only because within the world we live in, where there's time and space, we have to put words in one particular order, and therefore we have to press together all these different ideas we have in order to produce a single sentence. And of course, we can assume then that people will think in the same way everywhere, but that the language that they will use to express in a sentence, that operates in a different ways. The terms which undergo the coatings, the members of the word pairs embedded in the network, are, as we've seen, of two types. The categoremes, and then I'm using here the very medieval term, but why? Because it's much more telling than that what recent linguistics has developed, the terms it has used. The categoremes that stand for universal terms, which we've called labels, such as elephant, and the demonstratives standing for exemplars, the latter being proper nouns, such as Oscar, demonstratives like this, or pronouns like I or you, these two being what linguists after Franz Boas, the famous American anthropologist of the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and Roman Jacobson called shifters. Roman Jacobson being a linguist who I was lucky enough to attend a lecture of at La Sorbonne in Paris in the 1970s. Franz Boas and Roman Jacobson. The first layer of coating is where relationship terms are fitted between the two terms of the word pair in what can be regarded as a word pair expansion. In fact, within philosophy, that's what Immanuel Kant called a judgment. These terms are of different types. If the relationship is that of a hereditary field, like I've been describing, I've been talking about the network in our mind being constituted according to two principles. One is hereditary and the other one I call endogenous. These terms are of two different types. If the relationship is that of a hereditary field, then the words introduced between the halves of the word pair are some equivalent or other of is a. In this kind of usage, to be is usually referred to be as a copula. Such clauses, as we've seen, are only then valid in terms of their truth if the proper quantifiers are applied. This was very much the topic of the prior lecture, lecture 18. For instance, all dogs are canines, some canines are dogs. You can't say all dogs are canines, therefore all canines are dogs. No, dogs are part species of the canines, and therefore when you speak of the canines as a whole, you have to say you can only say that some canines are dogs. If the relationship belongs to Aristotle's 10 categories, I devoted a number of lectures to Aristotle's 10 categories, which constitute what I call the endogenous fields, where relationship can be described as being of a is a type, but also of a has a type, and more particularly of a has a type. If the relationship belongs to Aristotle's 10 categories, the kind of qualification you can put on a word that describes some substance. He described 9 ways you could actually describe that substance in one way or other. Then the range is more varied, and depending on which it will be expressed. For milk white is milk as is white. Alexander horse is Alexander has a horse with to have in a copula-like function. Oscar London will mean Oscar is in London. Tower midnight will mean I'm looking at the tower at midnight, and so on. In English, the relationship has a can be expressed through the genitive with Alexander's horse instead of Alexander has a horse or the horse of Alexander. Alexander's horse reverses, however, the focus from the horse names Bucephalus to Alexander as being its owner. Sometimes, Like in the genitive, there's no additional term between the two members of the word pair as one of them is turned into an adjective or into a verb. Violet blue becomes the blue violet or the blue violets. This can be seen in this example. It is the article the in such cases, which is the additional term indicating the relationship in the word pair expansion. The, just as well as blue, expresses the determination of violet. It can act at the same time as a quantifier, as in the contrast between the blue violet and blue violets. The term used when denoting such term as the or blue in the linguistic analysis of Chinese is a determinant. And it is therefore the term I will retain as well, determinant. Verbs are used also as determinants. Elephants fly can lead to the elephant is flying, the elephant flies, the flying elephant. Verbs allow to accumulate a number of Aristotle's categories simultaneously. It tells about acting or enduring, location in time, providing also rough view on quantity. Elephants were flying, tells about acting, position, quantity, and time. Determinants can also be expressed in English through other speech parts, like adverbs, numerals for quantity, or words like tomorrow for the expression of time, or over there for location, etc. The types 2 to 5 allow to render word pairs within the field of Aristotle's categories. Further word functions are needed to ensure broader speech acts units like whole sentences. And among those, first is the recaller, what may call the recaller, and which is usually referred to as being the anaphor, which refers to a member of a word pair without mentioning it explicitly, like with she, he, or word pair like it, who, that, etc. The anaphor is quite revealing of the working of short-term memory and, as I hold it, of the affect dynamics underlying speech performance. Indeed, it seems to us that only the very precise and lasting affect value of terms used sometime earlier within a speech act allows to refer to them through very indefinite markers such as her or which. And this to me is very much the central mechanism, what's happening essentially within the transformer. That's where I would say the intelligence really lies, in that possibility to summon at the same time, simultaneously, a number of words with their meanings, in order to let emerge a global meaning for them all, which will be the meaning of a sentence and so on. And that, I believe, has been made possible by that parallel reading that the transformer operates, and where the magic to me is actually happening. Okay, I will be back to some of these issues that I raised here. I introduced a number of ideas, views about these coatings, but I will need to get back to them and to make some more accurate and more precise definitions of what I've been describing here in a very summary manner. Okay, I hope to see you soon for lecture number 20. Bye-bye.